I'd like to bring in now viewers watching us on the main network of the CBC across the country. Tell you exactly what you're witnessing here. There have been terrorist attacks, to quote the U.S. President George W. Bush, in the United States. Now, as I was trying to figure out what's happened here, the second of the twin towers of the World Trade Center, the second of the towers has apparently collapsed. This tragedy just continues to get worse, folks, if this could be at all possible. The second of the Twin Towers, 110-story building, has collapsed after a jet collided with the plane, this shortly after 9 o'clock this morning in an apparent terrorist attack. Two planes, one hit each tower, the first shortly before 9 o'clock this morning, the second shortly after 9 o'clock this morning. The fires continue to burn, and as we say, here we go. There's a shot of that second plane colliding with one of the twin towers. This after 18 minutes after the first plane had collided while the fire was burning. This happening on live television. The second plane colliding with the second of the twin towers, 110-story buildings in Lower Manhattan. U.S. President George W. Bush saying it is an apparent terrorist attack. Transportation safety officials saying there was no way this could have been an accident. There were reports that at least one plane had been hijacked, an American Airlines 767, shortly before the first collision. Now, what we saw there before our eyes was we're going to get shot here. This is of the tower collapsing. This happened just moments ago. The 110-story World Trade Center tower collapsing while the fire was burning after a plane had collided with that as people were trying to be rescued. I may add, folks, here that thousands of people work in these two buildings. The attacks happening, as I mentioned, around 9 o'clock, the start of the busy working day in Manhattan. This is the financial district. Before your eyes, something you've never seen and something no one would ever want to see again. That is a 110-story building collapsing before our eyes shortly after an apparent terrorist attack of a plane flying directly into that building. At the time of the collapse of the building, fire officials were both trying to evacuate people from the building, evacuate the building, and to try to put out the fire itself. Now, since this happened, a little over an hour ago, we've had no reports of casualties or fatalities. I think we can draw our own conclusions here. This is horrific beyond belief. As we see, at least one building has fallen. We do not know the shape. We had heard a report from an eyewitness who was inside one of these buildings saying that the center core of the building had in fact collapsed within the building after the plane had collided with it. To quote that person, he said things at the time were under control. Clearly, folks, they are not under control. No idea the state of the second building, though you can see before your eyes that the fire continues to burn in the second of the twin towers of the World Trade Center. We should mention it was February 1993 when there was a terrorist attack on this site, a bomb that was detonated in the underground parking garage. At that time, February 1993, 6 people died, more than 1,000 people injured. This, though, the scope of this tragedy, far beyond that. This is the first front of the terrorist attack. Now, what happened minutes later was a second front in the terrorist attack open. This in the U.S. Capitol, Washington, D.C., where we got a report of another plane. This one had collided with the U.S. Pentagon. An explosion there, a fire burning in the U.S. Pentagon. What that has led to, of course, scenes of chaos in Washington as well, as major buildings, including the White House, the U.S. Capitol, the Treasury Building, of course, the Pentagon itself, have all been evacuated there for fear of further terrorist attacks. U.S. President George W. Bush saying that they will hunt down and find the folks who committed this act. And I should mention this was before the attack in Washington, calling it then a national tragedy, this far exceeding anything beyond belief of what is going on right now as officials try to figure out what is happening. Now, we can tell you that the FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority in the United States has grounded all air travel across the United States, trying to get all planes and aircraft out of the sky after reports that planes were being hijacked and could apparently be used in these terrorist attacks to perpetrate them. We're going to go back, for those of you just joining us on News World and the main network of the CBC, to get another view of the collapse of the World Trade Tower, one of the two twin towers there. This happened just minutes ago as firefighters were trying to bring the scene under control, evacuate the building, and put out the fire. Just wait for it. This is we're replaying tape. There you see the building come down. A horrific scene. They had evacuated the area around there for fears that there could be, initially there were reports that there could be a third plane en route for the building. So the area around there had been evacuated, but there were still people inside the building. There were still rescue people inside the building who were there trying to help the people. We're joined now on the phone by Mark Wolfson. He's with FEMA, the federal emergency officials in the United States. We're speaking to him on the phone. Mark Wolfson, what can you tell us about what is going on right now? Let's begin with Washington.
Okay. Well, if you saw the president's brief remarks, he has brought the federal government to full alert, and we are coordinating, as our job is in the Federal Emergency Management Agency, to coordinate federal response to a situation like this in support of what's going on in New York. We are also there are high-level meetings going on in Washington right now between senior officials of all the agencies that will be involved in the response effort to this situation. And needless to say, our agency is at high alert. Our operations center has been activated, and we are working very closely with our counterparts at the FBI as our operations plan for terrorist attacks outline.
Mark, are you still there?
I'm here.
Okay, now we've seen this carried out on two fronts. Obviously Manhattan, where we're seeing the pictures of the World Trade Center. One of them has collapsed. One of the Twin Towers has collapsed. We've also seen the pictures of the Pentagon on fire after apparently a plane had collided there. Do you have any other reports right now of any other terrorist attacks in other sites in the U.S.?
No, I have no other reports at this point. And we are very busy right now trying to get everything coordinated down here, so I really can't spend too much time on the phone with you.
Okay, Mark, we're going to let you go. Obviously, you've got work to handle as Mark Wolfson and the Federal Emergency Management Agency tries to catch up with what is going on down there. So do we. We're watching a national tragedy, as the U.S. President has called it, unfold before our eyes on live television. This is something unparalleled. I can tell you that right now, after we saw an attack on the U.S. On the Trade Center, the World Trade Center. One of the towers has collapsed as firefighters were trying to put out a fire after a jet plane, had collided with the building. This is the scene of the tower collapsing before our eyes. This happened just minutes ago. The other tower, the fire continues to burn there after a plane had collided with that building shortly before 9 o'clock this morning in an apparent terrorist attack. Now, while all this was happening, further attacks going on in Washington, in the U.S. Capitol, as a building had also, a plane had also attacked the U.S. Pentagon. We're joined now by our correspondent in Washington, the CBC's Henry Champ. Henry, we're scrambling for details. What can you tell us about what's going on in Washington at this hour?
Well, it's an utter chaos here. It's very much like an action movie that you would expect Hollywood to make. People are running throughout the streets. I just come from the White House, which has been evacuated of all personnel. The place was a madhouse. There were police cars, fire engines, helicopters flying overhead. The nearby Treasury building was also evacuated. Several banks in the area all shut down. And in the streets, you can see people running about as if they were lemmings, not sure which way to go. Taxi cabs caught up in mammoth traffic jams. It's just an image of chaos here. And of course, what makes it even worse, Mark, is that people get snatches of information that some big explosions occurred in New York. They don't exactly know what it is. People on cell phones phoning their families. It really is a frightening sight to watch people dealing with this early stages of these bombings in New York.
Now, Henry, we'd also heard a report of a fire burning in the mall in Washington. Can you tell us anything else about that?
I don't know anything about a fire burning in the mall, although there certainly has been fire engine activity down in that direction. There doesn't appear at the moment to have been any terrorist-inspired activity in Washington, from what we can tell, but there certainly is a lot of reaction from police departments, fire departments, and keep in mind we have a number of fire departments here. Now, the first family, the normal plan would be that they would be evacuated from the White House in the state of national emergency, which I don't think we've reached yet, to an area in Virginia. Whether they have actually physically left the building yet or not, we're still trying to find out. But there's no question that the government of the United States has, in all practical senses, shut down. I don't mean that decisions aren't being made or that there isn't reactions to these events, but the buildings in which you would expect this kind of activity are closing and closing fast.
But Henry, we should mention, too, for people who have joined us later, that the U.S. president was not in Washington at the time of this attack.
That's correct. He is in Florida, where he's doing an education information meeting. But the remainder of his family and those close to the leadership are here, and they have been evacuated from the White House.
Now, so from the best of your knowledge right now, Henry, and forgive me as I just try to put all the pieces together here, from what we understand, there has been only one attack in Washington itself, this on the Pentagon.
That's correct, yes. That crossed the Potomac River in Virginia at the Pentagon. We have had an attack. The details are still fairly sketchy, but it does appear that it's part of a concentrated activity that included those explosions in New York.
Yeah, it was the U.S. president himself, as we all try to draw conclusions about what's going on here. As I mentioned, this unfolding before our eyes, it was the U.S. president who said it was, about an hour ago that this was, quote, an apparent terrorist attack, end quote. These comments coming from Florida, where he was on a tour, and it should be mentioned, these comments coming before the second front opened up, this one in Washington that Henry is just telling us about right now, after the two planes had collided 18 minutes apart with the World Trade Towers, 110-story buildings. And as we saw just moments ago, the second of those buildings, which had taken the second attack, the second plane, shortly after 9 o'clock, it has collapsed. A 110-story building. Images here taken watching that building go by. Unspeakable horror as we watch and try to figure out what is going on. And we've got to mention, too, Henry, that the fire continues to burn in the other of the tower, which was the scene of the first attack, believed to be somewhere in the 80th or 90th floors of that building. People were still in that building. They were still trying to evacuate the building, still trying to get people to safety when the other tower collapsed. I don't know, Henry, if you've got any other information you can share with us about what's going on in New York.
Not definitively, except to get back to this issue of a terrorist attack. The president did indicate that that's what the issue was, that there was no question terrorists were involved, and we're led to believe that that came from the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board. They apparently aware that one of those planes, certainly the first one that crashed into the tower, was the victim of a hijacking. Details on that, of course, still sketchy yet at the moment, but enough to indicate that this was a planned attack against the United States.
Yeah, the National Transportation Safety Board had said that earlier on in the game after the planes had collided, given the fact, well, two things. First, that the flying conditions were actually, absolutely fine in New York. As you can see the pictures behind, that it's a clear day in New York City. There was some speculation that there could have been a plane in distress after the first collision. However, that speculation was dashed after the second collision, when we saw before our eyes a plane that had clearly targeted the second of the twin towers. Henry, you've got more?
Yes, I have. Just to quickly interrupt you, we're now getting a report of a fire at the State Department. We don't have the details just exactly of to what extent that building is involved, but there is a fire there. And now the District of Columbia Police are saying that all federal buildings in the capital are being evacuated. So now we have an incident reported at the Pentagon and one at the State Department, and all federal buildings being evacuated. And I can tell you from the position I'm in here, looking over to the Treasury building and to the White House complex, now the streets almost appear bare. We told you about the activity that was that took place when the evacuation was going on, of people running back and forth, seemingly uncertain of which way to go. Clearly, people have moved away from these buildings, and now as you look down towards the government complex on Pennsylvania Avenue, you see very little traffic and very little sign of individuals on the street.
And what we are seeing, Henry, now on our screens is shots of the Pentagon, the fire that continues clearly to burn there, a huge plume of smoke coming up right now from that building after reports that a plane had collided with that building earlier this morning. This after the two plane collisions in New York City. It should be mentioned as we just try to also piece together the information we're getting in as far as New York City is concerned, that all the bridges and tunnels had been closed getting onto the island of Manhattan right now as they try to secure the scene there. Also concerned that there could be further acts of terrorism on bridges and tunnels going in onto the island of Manhattan. And federal authorities across the United States who are now getting reports on a state of alert, as far away as Los Angeles as well right now, for fear that there could be a third or fourth fronts opening up in what appears to be a terrorist attack in the United States. Henry, you're just getting more information?
No, just that we now are getting information that the Capitol building, that's the congressional buildings themselves, the Senate and the House, are also being evacuated, which means that the government activity in that region has closed. We're told that police have now got a cordon around the Capitol building, 2 full city blocks back, and there are reports that a plane had been circulating the building. We have no idea whether that is an offensive threat to the building or whether that was a protective aircraft, but that's the kind of reporting we're getting. So just to quickly go through it, we have fires at the Pentagon and the State Department. We have a total evacuation of all government buildings, and the U.S. Capitol Hill has now been evacuated as well.
Henry, needless to say, unprecedented. There's been talk, especially around the millennium, about fears of terrorist attacks in the United States. Some people had said at many occasions that these fears were overblown, that there wasn't a legitimate threat to the United States. Clearly, what's happening today has got to change people's opinion on that.
Well, there's no question about that, and that was clearly in the eyes and the minds of people that I saw struggling on the street. I can't tell you, Mark, and I can't impress upon you just the total fear that there was in the area of the White House and many government buildings about 45 minutes ago. People really did feel that somehow they personally were at threat, and they were running literally for their lives. There's no question of what you're saying on the issue of a terrorist attack. It is the American fears worst felt. It is, too, an indication of just how difficult it is to protect against a terrorist activity. If all of these events are terrorist activity, and we're led to believe that they are, that it really doesn't take a lot to put this nation, this particular city and New York into pandemonium.
Yeah, we should mention it was back in 1993, of course, that there was a terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. At that time, it was a bomb that was detonated in the underground parking garage. That incident killed 6 people, left more than 1,000. This is well beyond that, clearly, after we saw the 110-story building collapse minutes ago in New York City. Now, and we should add that speculation is rampant, but it was the U.S. president himself who called this an apparent terrorist attack as information comes in. We had seen on the wire someone reporting that there was a Palestinian extremist group which had claimed responsibilities for that. It's early in this right now investigation. I think people are just trying to figure out first, trying to save the people inside these buildings, evacuate, as Henry's mentioning, the buildings in the key sectors in Washington, D.C., and try to at least control the situation. And in the case of the World Trade Center, as we're seeing there, the fire is still burning, and there are reports of people still being in that building as they try to rescue people, get them out of there. We do know, as we mentioned before, that all air traffic across the United States has been grounded until further notice after an American Airlines 767 was hijacked out of Boston. Now, the FBI is investigating the report that it was that plane that was used, that 767, in the first attack on the building that you're seeing before your eyes. There was an attack 18 minutes later at the second of the Twin Towers. That building has since collapsed, collapsing before our eyes on live television. Moments after that, a second front opened up, this one in Washington, D.C., in the U.S. Capitol, as there's been an attack on the Pentagon building there, and as Henry's also pointed out, a fire burning in the State Department. All of these buildings have been evacuated. Henry, what else can you tell us from Washington, from your viewpoint in Washington?
Well, just that there still is this continuing pandemonium. You can probably hear the alarms going off behind me. I'm not exactly certain, but we have now what appears to be the response of the D.C. Fire Department to yet another fire downtown. And as I say, minute by minute, the downtown area of Washington, of which the National Press Building that I'm occupying at the moment is part of, there are fewer and fewer people, more and more police, more and more activity on the part of police cruisers. There are obviously several VIP limousines being escorted by police cruisers. There would obviously be at the moment, if you close down the building, nonetheless some necessity to regroup leading government officials, because we are in, they would say, a fight at the moment against this terrorist activity. There's no question that the possibility of further incidents occurred would require decision-making from the very top. So pandemonium still in the streets here, but most people making every effort to get out of the heart of Washington as quickly as they can.
Henry, what can you tell us about security around key buildings like the Pentagon? Clearly planes, because there were reports that there were aircraft that may have been circling before this collision at the Pentagon. I mean, there must be a certain measures that are put in place to restrict any air travel around these buildings. I know that applies for the White House. Trying to figure out how this could have happened.
Well, of course, it's true that there are security measures, but if you recall, there was an incident where an individual flying a small plane actually flew his plane into the White House, striking the ground first, landing up against the White House, not causing any damage. That a few years ago. But the Pentagon and many of these government buildings, of course, are on the flight path of planes coming into the Reagan National Airport here. So while, yes, it is true there are emergency activities, and you can bet that planes won't be flying over those buildings right now, in normal times, there's quite a bit of air traffic over the Capitol and over many of these buildings. The White House itself often has planes flying directly over it when the flight path demands that planes fly north and south if they are landing into Reagan National. So yes, there are safeguards, but the truth of the matter is the approach to these buildings from the sky is fairly easy, I would assume, for those who are bent on a terrorist activity. And on the ground, security in most of these buildings is very, very complex and secure inside the building, but you can approach to the outside of these buildings. Even the White House, a good baseball throw from the street would hit the White House. There's a lot of security inside the gates, but the gates are still fairly close to individuals who are going by.
We're also getting a report, Henry, as we try to get our information here, that a portion of the second tower that was hit at the World Trade Center appears to have collapsed as well. A huge plume of smoke obscuring the Twin Towers. We're seeing a live shot there after the other building, the second of the Twin Towers collapsed, about half an hour ago, as fire officials were trying to put out the fire in that. This after the second of two attacks on that building. And Henry, I guess what grabs me in this, among the many things here, is that the U.S. president had already said that this was an apparent terrorist attack, and this was before there had been any attack in Washington. Interesting to find out if we'll be able to at some point what measures had been taken in Washington after these apparent terrorist attacks had occurred in Manhattan, whether these buildings were being secured, whether these buildings were being evacuated after the apparent attacks in Manhattan.
Well, I can tell you that at the White House, where I was this morning broadcasting to your show, you'll recall shortly before these incidents occurred, there was no apparent sign of any increased security. Okay. And even after the attacks in New York, it was pretty much business as usual. I think the incident at the Pentagon was what spurred the activity here. But quite frankly, I think there was a feeling in Washington that there was a serious, difficult, an unhappy event taking place in New York, but nobody made the correlation that somehow Washington would be involved only a few minutes later. Once that happened, in the very vernacular, common vernacular, all hell broke loose here.
Okay, and we, all hell broke loose, of course, in Manhattan. We actually have some tape of that. This was people scrambling to get out of the World Trade Towers after the two planes had collided with the towers. Let's go to that tape if we can see that.
My thing here. Real quickly. You were in the, which tower?
I was in B tower.
B tower?
A tower.
What floor were you on?
B1.
What floor?
First one.
What happened? Tell me.
When a big explosion happened, some guy came out, his skin was all off. I helped him out. This is him all over. There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
Anything else that you saw? Were you there for the second hit by the plane?
About 10 minutes later, the second building went off.
Did you see it?
Yes, I saw it. It just blew up. A big explosion. People started running. It was just chaos everywhere. People jumping out. People just kept jumping and jumping and jumping. And you could still see they were alive because they were flailing around.
The FBI has already stepped in to investigate. It could be possibly a terrorist strike.
It could be. It could be because the first one went off and then 10 minutes later this just blew up out of nowhere.
Hard to think that that would just be accidental.
No, I don't think it would be accidental.
Back it up, folks. Back it up.
Kenny?
Johanneman.
Spell your name.
Johannemann.
And you were working there?
Yes, I was right there. I was down in the basement, came down, all of a sudden the elevator blew up, smoke. I dragged the guy out, his skin was hanging off, and I dragged him out, and I helped him out to the ambulance.
Thank you.
Right?
Westbound. Back up, please. Back up, please.
That was the scene just minutes ago in New York. Actually, as you can see behind, at the time when we were getting the eyewitness reports of what was going on, both of the Twin Towers were still standing. Since then, one of them has collapsed. A 110-story building, one of the largest buildings in the world, has collapsed after an apparent terrorist attack of a plane, what believed to be a hijacked plane that was flown directly into that building. Now, we are getting word that flights that were bound for Washington, D.C. and New York have been rerouted to Canada because air traffic has been grounded across the United States. Transport Minister David Collinette saying that they are monitoring the situation here in Canada, that we are taking security very seriously here as well. To quote the minister, that we are also here in Canada on alert for any possible attacks as well. Although it should be mentioned right now what has happened, 2 attacks. There have been in Manhattan, one plane colliding with one Twin Tower. 18 minutes later, oh my God. Oh my God. If you can imagine the situation could get any worse, you've just seen it get worse. That was the second tower of the World Trade Center collapsing before our eyes. The second tower collapsing as rescue officials were trying to evacuate the building, trying to put the fire out that after a plane had collided there shortly before 9 o'clock this morning. Both towers at the World Trade Center, 110-story buildings, have collapsed.
What happened at the Pentagon?
We can tell you that, as U.S. President George Bush says, it's an apparent terrorist attack. It's playing out on 2 fronts in the United States. Here, unspeakable horror in Manhattan, where 2 buildings have now collapsed, the 2 buildings, the World Trade Towers. As well, a plane has collided with the Pentagon as well in Washington, where a fire continues to burn there. All major U.S. government buildings in Washington, from the White House on down, have been evacuated. Authorities on high alert across the United States for any further attacks. This is the scene from Washington right now, where, as mentioned, the fire continues to burn in the Pentagon. Our correspondent Henry Champ says, as far as his information goes, there has only been that one attack in Washington itself. Although, as he said, all hell has broken loose on the streets of that city as people try to get out of the city core, to try to get away from the government buildings, fearing there could be more attacks. Henry, let's check back in with Henry to see more we can tell. Henry, what more can you tell us from your vantage point in the U.S. Capitol?
Well, we talked to you a moment ago about a fire at the State Department. We can now confirm that that was a car bombing that took place outside the State Department. We don't have any damage reports or any injury report. But again, a car bombing involved at the State Department, and the pattern of these events brings us more and more conclusively towards the fact that we're in the midst of a large, on-scale terrorist attack against American institutions. So we have the attacks in New York, the attack against the Pentagon involving an aircraft, and now we have a car bombing at the State Department.
We heard earlier from an eyewitness in New York City who was mentioning pulling an injured person from one of the trade tower buildings. I can tell you that is the only report so far we've heard of any injuries or fatalities, although clearly there will be an unspeakable scale of fatalities after the collapse of these two buildings. The fire that is burning at the Pentagon, as Henry reports, a car bombing. We've got no reports right now of the injuries or fatalities. But as we see, the situation continues to unfold before our eyes. And a huge fear in the United States right now that it's not over yet, this apparent terrorist attack, which is underway in the United States. Now, I don't know if we can can we dip back into WABC to get any information?
Or exactly what happened that caused that second tower to collapse, we cannot tell you. CNN's Kelly Wallace is on the phone with us. Kelly, where are you? What can you tell us?
Aaron, I'm just about 4 blocks north of the location of where the World Trade Center was standing. I was actually en route to the command center, people really staring in disbelief. And then as you saw, of course, the pictures watching that tower come down, people just couldn't believe their eyes. Police then pushing people immediately, people turning around and starting running blocks away from the site. There is black smoke and is covering the air. You see people covering their mouths with some handkerchiefs and their coats, and basically, it's an unbelievable scene. Most of the people have gone. The police are really pushing people away. There were a lot of people, as I was making my way down here, Aaron, people just staring, getting on the cell phone, crying, recounting stories where they sort of, basically had seen what happened earlier today, trying to get in touch with loved ones, very concerned. And then, of course, some people watching the other tower come down earlier, and then a group of people then watching this other tower come down, a woman passing me covered in soot. Basically, the sky is just black. You can't even see down to lower Manhattan from the vantage point right now. The police have cleared off all these streets, pushing people away. Police telling us if you have to get out of here, to get out of here, pushing people away in garages. It's an unbelievable scene, Aaron.
You could see in this shot, our viewers can, a helicopter shot coming across the harbor, the Statue of Liberty prominent in the foreground, and smoke and devastation and tragedy in the background. A tragedy that continues to unfold, and one that still has many, many unanswered questions. We have a report now that a car bomb has exploded at the State Department.
And the attack appears to have moved from New York to Washington as a plane hit the Pentagon at 9:35, and then the State Department, a car bomb exploded.
We're about to see it here, Jim. The second tower just completely collapses on itself. And we don't know what caused the collapse, but it seems...
We're listening in live to WABC, to journalists there. They, like us, trying to piece together the extent of this apparent terrorist attack on two fronts in the United States, in New York City, as well as in Washington, D.C. I'd like to hand things over right now to our chief journalist, Peter Mansbridge, for more coverage of this story. Peter.
The building just couldn't withstand
the scene in New York, as we're trying to bring in details as quickly as we can. Obviously, the island of Manhattan enveloped in this.
Okay, we are back. We are just going to get Peter back online as we continue to watch this. If you've just joined us and you're wondering what you are seeing right there, this is the aftermath after both twin towers at the World Trade Center collapsed. 110-story buildings collapsed after planes, apparently hijacked jet planes, collided with each building. Now, while fire officials were trying to evacuate the building, this is tape. We're going to go watch. This is the first of the buildings that actually came down. As fire officials were trying to secure the area, trying to get people out of the building, we were watching on live television as the first of the buildings collapsed before our eyes. The attacks occurring, just bear with us here. There you see in the background the first of the twin towers coming to the ground. We're not sure if there were any other explosions at that time. We can tell you that a plane had collided with that building shortly after 9 o'clock Eastern Time. A plane had, quite apparently by no accident, according to National Transportation Safety Board officials, a plane had targeted that building. That was 18 minutes after a plane had collided with this building. Minutes ago, this was the scene. A terrorist attack beyond belief unfolding before our eyes in the United States. As we mentioned, this attack has opened on two fronts. The first here in Manhattan, in the busy lower Manhattan, obviously the business center of the United States, the business center arguably of the world. The second front opening minutes later when a plane then veered into and collided with the Pentagon building in Washington, D.C. As well, we've got a report of a car bomb that detonated outside the U.S. State Department building there, triggering a fire. We have had no words yet whatsoever on fatalities, on injuries, though you can draw your own conclusions after two 110-story buildings collapsed in the heart.
It appears a plane has hit the Pentagon building and a car bomb outside the State Department. So that's some of the old video from New York just in the last couple of hours. This now looking back live at the island of Manhattan, where it is still just total devastation and chaos all over that end of the of Manhattan. We should also advise you that there is now a major Canadian angle to this story, because all air traffic from New York and Washington and all transatlantic flights heading in that direction has been diverted to Canada. Many of them are starting to arrive in the next little while at Pearson International Airport here in Toronto, so we'll obviously be watching that as well. What happened here today? Well, it's going to be a while before we know for sure, but it appears that aircraft were hijacked and were sent on their missions towards New York and the World Trade Center. This is a live shot of the Pentagon building in the U.S., just across the Potomac River from the Capitol and the White House buildings. The Pentagon is that Pentagon-shaped building, and you can see the smoke pouring out from one side. I believe that's near the side that faces the Arlington National Cemetery. What happened here at the Pentagon is still unclear, but we're going to try and update you on that and try to get the latest information possible, both on what happened at the Pentagon and also what happened at the State Department, where there's apparently a car bomb outside. We're going to be joined by Henry Champier, who's in our Washington studios at the moment. Henry, both those buildings in the process still, I assume, of being evacuated, the White House as well. What can you tell us on the latest information? Do we have Henry Champ available to us in Washington? Hello, Henry.
Hello, Peter. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
The city is in virtual gridlock at the moment. It is very difficult to get into Washington from either Virginia or Maryland. People, of course, in very simple terms, Peter, fleeing the downtown area. Pandemonium we saw earlier when the evacuation of government buildings started among a crowd, of course, of people who had heard about explosions in New York but didn't quite understand the enormity of the event. You can hear the sirens of fire engines and police cars behind. We can tell you that at the Pentagon, we presume, although we don't have the specific details, that a plane has crashed into that building. At the State Department, we do know that a car bomb was set off approximately 45 minutes after the events that took place at the World Trade Center. What radios are reporting here in Washington, telling all people to leave the city core, the Washington city core. There is an effort on the part of police agencies to move senior personnel out of their buildings. All buildings are evacuated, but at the same time, those cabinet members, key officials from Congress and the White House are being evacuated, we presume, to a retreat in Northern Virginia. That will take some time. And we are also told that the president has cut short his visit, obviously, in Florida, and is returning to Andrews Air Force Base, is expected to land within the hour. There's no question that the government at the moment feels that it's at war with a terrorist group at the moment. The terrorist group is yet unidentified or its identity unconfirmed.
Henry, I got to stop you for a minute. We're just getting reports from Associated Press that there's been a large plane crashing in western Pennsylvania. Officials at the Somerset County Airport confirmed that. They're in Pittsburgh. Exactly where, what kind of plane, and why, we don't know, but the words large plane crashes is starting to sound very similar to what we've already heard in other parts, obviously, of this story in the last couple of hours. One has to assume if aircraft are being hijacked, are being sent on missions, that at a certain point the United States Defense forces have to take some kind of action and make some very difficult decisions if they are aware of aircraft in the air that have been hijacked, one assumes. Are you hearing anything on that front, Henry?
Well, first of all, the plan of the FAA was to immediately close down all outgoing flights from any airports within the continental United States. That was the first thing that was done. The second thing was to divert all planes in the air, particularly those international flights coming in over the Pacific or Atlantic to Canada, as you reported earlier. And then domestically, we are told, all pilots are told to land at the nearest possible airport as quickly as possible. And there's no doubt about the enormity of what you're saying. Planes then in the sky, after those things have been done, are going to be viewed with a great deal of suspicion, because clearly the use of aircraft in these terrorist activities so far today is a prime objective of the perpetrators of these crimes.
All right, just to further underline that, a large plane has crashed in western Pennsylvania. There are some unconfirmed reports of what type of aircraft this is, and I'm going to wait till that's confirmed, but it's a very big one, are some of the rumors that are circulating at this hour, unconfirmed. But what is confirmed is there has been yet another large aircraft crashing, this time in western Pennsylvania. As Henry mentioned, and as we mentioned earlier, many flights being diverted to Canada now as the airports have been closed in New York and in Washington. The Canadian military has stepped up its own security at a number of its bases, including in Halifax, where there are more guards than usual at the gates of the Halifax dockyard and at the Shearwater Air Base. Concern obviously spreading outside the borders of the United States at what is an incredibly horrific act. Let's try and get to the latest situation inside New York City. You're looking at pictures. There's a mixture of tape and live pictures here over this last little while as we try to keep you up to speed on the incredible scene. This shot is a live shot of the aftermath of the dropping now of both of the towers, of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. On the phone, Craig Wilson, who's a Canadian who works for CBS, one of the producers there, joins us from CBS headquarters, I believe, Craig, in New York. What is the latest you can tell us right now and the information that you're getting there?
Good morning, Peter. In fact, I am not at CBS. I'm at Midtown high-rise looking directly due south at what can only be described as grotesque scene. I'm in Midtown Manhattan at 42nd Street on the 38th floor of what actually is my wife's office building. It's the only building as far south as I could get. In fact, they are evacuating this building and most buildings in Midtown Manhattan, and do not know how long I'll have this perch. However, I can tell you that I live at 73rd Street, which is not that far to get to where I currently am, but the streets of Manhattan were unbelievably filled with panic. Not panic against the people rushing, but people wondering, you know, are their loved ones okay? Are their children okay? Mothers going home and fathers going home to take their children out of school. So I was going the opposite direction, and I'm looking down at Midtown Manhattan, and I see people in the streets. I see the streets quite empty of vehicles. As I was waiting to speak to you, I was listening to Henry Champ and speaking about gridlock in Washington. At least in Midtown Manhattan, it's exactly the opposite. The streets are very empty of vehicles, which is unusual this hour of the day, obviously, and full of people trying to get home.
You know, Craig, everybody is shying away from the discussion of what the casualties could be in this, but I mean, let's face it, we're talking about numbers that are unheard of in our lifetimes.
Well, it's sort of, I moved here shortly before the World Trade Center was first attacked, and I'm originally from Medicine, Alberta. I was astonished to discover that tens of thousands of people actually worked in those two towers, which, you know, is unbelievable to me, and I can't even imagine the human toll here, and I can only tell you, as I was waiting in the lobby of this building to be allowed to come up, and we're now being told this building is being evacuated, that there were people waiting in tears, not knowing what's going on. I do not know exactly how many people work in the World Trade Center towers or the surrounding buildings, but I can tell you it is in the tens of thousands. And this, what I'm looking at now is it's grotesque. I can't describe it any other way.
Craig,
yes, Peter.
Yeah, you better, if they're evacuating that building,
yes,
you better join that evacuation.
Yes,
we will, I'm sure, talk to you later on. You take care.
Thank you, sir.
Craig Wilson, Canadian, works for CBS, who is monitoring the situation from a nearby building in this incredible story. If you're just joining us, there have been a series of apparent terrorist attacks in New York City and in Washington today. Both towers of the World Trade Center are now gone, have fallen. This is tape from earlier. This is the second tower that collapsed. All this happened within less than 2 hours after aircraft, big aircraft, commercial jetliners, apparently hijacked, tore into the both towers of the World Trade Center. The structural damage was enormous, and both buildings had collapsed in less than 2 hours after they were hit by the aircraft. There is no doubt that people did get out of those buildings. How many got out? How many never had the chance? We do not know at this hour. In Washington, there has been an attack on the Pentagon building of some sort. There has been a car bombing outside the State Department. The White House has been evacuated. The President of the United States, who is in Florida today, is on his way back to the nation's capital, and the crisis management team clearly full in effect there now. We're going to go to Henry Champ in just a moment. Quickly to Ottawa. Don Newman has been monitoring the reaction there, and the Prime Minister has put out a statement a few minutes ago. Don, what can you tell us there?
Peter, I have the Prime Minister's statement here. I think I'll just read it to you. I was stricken by the news and television pictures coming from the United States this morning. It is impossible to fully comprehend the evil that would have conjured up such a cowardly and depraved assault upon thousands of innocent people. There can be no cause or grievance that could ever justify such unspeakable violence. Indeed, such an attack is an assault not only on the targets, but an offense against the freedoms and rights of all civilized nations. All Canadians are praying that the brave firefighters and rescue crews who currently are on the scene will be successful in limiting the casualties. We stand ready to provide any assistance that our American friends may need at this very difficult hour and in subsequent investigations. Aileen, that is Mrs. Chrétien, joins me in offering on behalf of all Canadians our deepest sympathies to the families of the victims and to the American people. And that is put up by the Prime Minister, Peter. The Prime Minister is scheduled today to go to Halifax. Not clear now whether he is going to do that. He was going to go to Halifax and be available for comment on camera at about 1:15 Eastern Time in about 2.5 hours from now. Not clear, though, now that he is going ahead with that trip. Also, here in Ottawa, the Department of National Defence, the Security Intelligence Service, and the RCMP all meeting at this hour. So far, nothing visible has gone into effect, and they're not announcing anything. The Clerk of the House of Commons and the Sergeant-at-Arms of the House of Commons have also had a meeting to see if special security is needed on Parliament Hill. But that's where it stands in Ottawa at the moment.
All right, Don, thanks very much. We will get back to you throughout the day. Now, the latest on the situation in Pittsburgh, which is the latest incident we're aware of, about 10 a.m. Eastern Time. That's about 50 minutes ago, where they are now able to confirm that a large plane did crash just north of the Somerset County Airport. That's the main airport in Pittsburgh. It is believed now, Associated Press is saying it's believed that the aircraft was a Boeing 767, crashed about 8 miles east of Jennerstown, which is just north of the city of Pittsburgh. Sorry, the airport's about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh, so in fact it's quite a ways from Pittsburgh. But it's a 767. We're unsure of what has happened in that incident, but obviously on a day like this, one's suspicions tend towards a connection to what we have witnessed already here in New York and also in Washington. Once again, this is the horrific scene about 9 o'clock this morning, New York time, Eastern Time. You will see here this aircraft. You see it in the distance coming straight towards what at that point was the one trade tower, the World Trade Tower, that had not been hit earlier, 18 minutes before the first tower had been hit. You see the aircraft slamming into it and the after effect of that crash coming right through the building. Within an hour and a half of that, both towers had collapsed to the ground. There have been a number of discussions with people who were trapped in the upper portions of those towers. We heard them on radio link-ups, on phones, desperately trying to find a way out, some going to the roof, hoping helicopters could come to get them. We are not sure what happened in that situation. Both towers are now down. This is the collapse of the first one a little over an hour ago. The second one collapsed about 45 minutes ago. This is the second tower.
From where the World Trade Center towers used to stand, you're looking at the collapse of one of those towers right now. We now have an AP News alert out of Pittsburgh. Officials at Somerset County Airport are
so it just is almost too hard to comprehend. If you had watched a movie like this in a theater, you would say this could never happen. But you are witnessing the virtual siege of the United States today, as we see in its biggest city, New York, its biggest landmark, the two towers of the World Trade Center being hit by aircraft, apparently hijacked aircraft. The word has been still yet to be confirmed that there was an aircraft out of Boston on its way to Los Angeles that was hijacked and diverted towards New York City, was one of the aircraft. Still unclear on the other one. Henry Champ joins us from Washington. Henry, you can update us on something now?
Can now tell you that at least 3 aircraft were at some point or another this morning hijacked by apparent terrorists. The NTSB now confirming, and the Pentagon as well, confirming that the first plane that struck the World Trade Center was indeed that plane you're talking about that was flying out of Boston. I can also tell you that a small commuter plane, one of the short hop airliners that flies into Washington, was involved in the attack on the Pentagon. Apparently that plane, fortunately for those inside the Pentagon, hitting the ground first before skidding into the building, and the damage, while significant, does appear light, and there's hope that fatalities, if there are any, will be few. And then the Pentagon is now saying that they are monitoring another plane currently in the air that they believe has been hijacked. They give no further information other than that there is some belief it may be attempting to get near the Pentagon. So at least 3 planes have been hijacked, according to the Pentagon and according to the NTSB. Add into that, Peter, the fact that there was a car bombing at the State Department, and you can see that there was a very sophisticated operation that was mounted against the United States this morning.
Very very sophisticated, very coordinated, obviously, and there are going to be all kinds of suggestions as to who, if anybody, will or has already claimed responsibility for this. This whole notion of a third aircraft, Henry, that may be in the air, may be hijacked, places enormous pressure on the decision-making process in Washington as to what to do about this aircraft, if in fact there is one, and if they in fact know where it is and where it's heading.
Well, there's no question about that, because obviously if it is hijacked and bent on creating difficulty, then you'll excuse me because we've got behind us an enormous noise here, and I can tell you that what we're looking at is a cavalcade that just came down our street with some buses, clearly moving high-level officials from either the Treasury building or the White House complex, and they're moving out towards Virginia, trying to get through the traffic which has suddenly started to gridlock along our area. Getting back to that question of the plane, of course, if that plane has been hijacked, and if the Pentagon knows that's so, and in light of the 3 attacks already this morning, it will be a difficult decision. The other situation that is impacted as a result of this morning is that there now are no flights. It's almost unheard of to believe this. No flights taking off or landing, except those that were already in the air and are approaching airports and have been identified. There are no flights flying over the United States today.
All right, Henry, don't be shy about jumping in when you've got more details. We're going to move on and update on a couple of other fronts on this story. Just first of all, as you look at these still unbelievable pictures from New York City, live shots of the aftermath of the falling down of the 2 towers of the World Trade Center after they were hit by 2 aircraft, apparently hijacked, apparently in a very coordinated terrorist attack today. Here in Canada, the Solicitor General's office is now coordinating Canada's response. We've already heard a number of military bases where security has been tightened. Canada has offered up and now is using the Pearson International Airport here in Toronto for aircraft that are being diverted from the United States. You heard Henry say that the airports have been shut down in New York and Washington, and one assumes other areas as well. We can tell you that Israel has now closed and evacuated all its embassies all around the world as in its response to what has happened here today. Russia has announced that its air defenses are now on full alert. So you can obviously tell here the impact of this story, not only as we're watching the situation in New York, but around the world now, as people try to come to grips with not only what's happened here, but what it means, how it could have happened, who could be behind it, and what is the end game. Are we seeing now the end of what today's terrorist activity was, or are we still in the process of it? As Henry mentioned, there are reports of a 3rd aircraft that has been hijacked, that is in the air. We do know that a large plane believed to be a 767 has crashed near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. What connection, if any, it has to this story, we do not know. There has been a car bomb outside the State Department, and there has been an aircraft crash just outside the Pentagon building, but it appears that the damage there is light. The damage here in New York certainly is not light. We cannot even contemplate just how serious the casualty and death toll is. Now, let's quickly go to Ottawa. Don Newman can update us on something. Don?
Peter, Henry saying a few moments ago, no planes flying in the United States. That appears to be the case soon in Canada. We're getting reports that all the airports in Canada are going to be shut down as well. I guess the airports receiving planes in the air, and including those planes coming from Europe or from Asia across the Atlantic and Pacific, headed for the United States and coming instead to Pearson Airport. They will, of course, come in, and the airport will be open for that. But Transport Canada, we're told, is going to announce shortly that all of the airports in our country are going to be shut down as well. As you point out, the confusion over just who is behind this, and is this the end game or is this the beginning? What might happen next? The tension mounting in Canada now as well, and the airports, we are told, are going to be shut down.
Thank you very much, Don. So that looks like North America shut down from air travel today, and one assumes if this is still in the process or if officials do not have their hands on exactly what's going on here, one of the ways to try and sort it out is to get all traffic, air traffic that you do have control of, on the ground, and then try to determine what your situation is after that. Have been we're trying to be as cautious as we can here on a number of things, but there have been a number of reports on the aircraft that went into the World Trade Center. We can tell you that the latest information on that is that it was an American Airlines flight, the first one, flying from Boston to Los Angeles, that was hijacked, diverted to New York, and crashed into the first tower of the World Trade Center. AFP, the French news agency, is now reporting that the second plane was a United Airlines 737, and many aviation experts who've